June 23, 1942, 14:47 hours, 800 feet above South Wales, a Focke-Wulf 190A-3 fighter descended through scattered cumulus clouds trailing thin ribbons of black smoke from a punctured fuel line. The aircraft's distinctive wide-track landing gear extended like the talons of a hunting bird preparing to strike. Below, the patchwork greens and browns of the Welsh countryside spread out in neat geometric patterns, farmland untouched by war, peaceful under the afternoon sun. Inside the cramped cockpit, Oberleutnant Thomas Weber, 22 years old, tasted copper on his tongue. His hands trembled on the control stick. Sweat plastered dark hair to his forehead, despite the cold air rushing through gaps in the damaged canopy seal. The compass before him spun uselessly, the needle dancing between headings like a broken clock. The fuel gauge sat perilously close to empty, the needle quivering just above the red line. Weber didn't know it yet, but in less than 6 minutes he would touch down on British soil, alive, with the Third Reich's most advanced fighter aircraft intact beneath him. And not a single RAF officer would believe what they were seeing. The hook was already written in the sky. A German ace fleeing for his life, a British airfield crew preparing for a routine Tuesday afternoon, and a landing so catastrophic for the Luftwaffe it would shift the balance of aerial combat for the rest of the war. But right now, at this precise moment, Thomas Weber was focused on one thing only: finding the coast of France before his fuel tanks ran completely dry and his burning fighter became his coffin. His mission had begun 43 minutes earlier. 9:30 hours that morning, Morlaix Airfield occupied Brittany. The briefing room had smelled of stale cigarette smoke and weak ersatz coffee. 12 pilots from Jagdgeschwader 2 sat on wooden benches, listening to the operations officer outline their assignment. Standard escort patrol. Protect Junkers 88 bombers returning from a raid on Plymouth. The Royal Navy dockyards had been the target. Intelligence suggested minimal fighter opposition. The British were conserving their strength for something bigger. Weber had sat in the second row beside Klaus Hoffmann. Klaus, 23 years old, 4 confirmed victories. A farmer's son from Bavaria with a perpetual grin and hands too large for the delicate work of flying fighters. They'd flown together for 7 months. 14 missions. Klaus had saved Weber's life twice. Weber had returned the favor once. That was how it worked. You flew together, you fought together, you kept each other alive. The operations officer had pointed to a map of the English Channel with a wooden pointer. Weather-scattered cumulus, 3,000 to 6,000 feet. Visibility 8 miles. Sea state moderate. You'll meet the bombers here 20 miles southwest of Plymouth at 1300 hours. Escort them home. Expected opposition minimal. The British are licking their wounds from last week. Weber had raised his hand. Fuel. 115 gallons per aircraft. More than sufficient. Cruise consumption at 180 miles per hour, 55 gallons per hour. Total mission time, 2 hours maximum. You'll have 30 minutes reserve. The math had been simple, comfortable. Weber had written it in his logbook. 115 gallons, 2.1 hours maximum endurance. Plenty of margin. He hadn't accounted for combat damage. Nobody ever did. By 1300 hours, Weber and Klaus were at 12,000 feet, 15 miles southwest of Plymouth, when they made contact with the returning bombers. 6 Junkers 88s flying in loose formation, black smoke trailing from one aircraft's port engine. The bomber crews were exhausted, their aircraft shot up by anti-aircraft fire, limping home on damaged wings and prayer. Weber's Focke-Wulf 190 felt like an extension of his body. The aircraft represented the pinnacle of German aeronautical engineering in 1942. WW2 01D2 engine, 14 cylinders arranged in 2 radial rows, 1,700 horsepower, enough power to pull the compact fuselage through the air at 408 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. The armament was devastating. 2 7.92 mm MG-17 machine guns mounted in the engine cowling, 1,000 rounds each. 2 20 mm MG-151/20 cannons in the wing roots, 250 rounds per gun. When all 4 weapons fired simultaneously, the Focke-Wulf could shred an enemy fighter in seconds. The British feared this aircraft. Weber knew that. Every German pilot knew that. RAF intelligence reports described it as superior to the Spitfire Mark V in every category except turning radius. It climbed faster, it dove faster, it rolled faster at combat speeds, it hit harder. For 6 months since the type entered service in France, Focke-Wulf 190 pilots had been running up scores against the RAF like children playing a rigged game. Weber had 7 confirmed victories, 3 Spitfires, 2 Hurricanes, 1 Wellington bomber, 1 Blenheim. The red spinner on his aircraft's propeller hub marked him as a rising ace. His squadron mates joked that he'd make 20 kills by Christmas. He'd laughed and said nothing. Superstition ran deep among fighter pilots. You didn't tempt fate by counting victories before they happened. At 14:12 hours, the trap sprang shut. They came from above. 8 Spitfire Mark V's from 611 Squadron diving from 18,000 feet with the afternoon sun behind them. Perfect positioning. The British lead pilot had chosen his moment with precision. Wait until the German escorts were below, distracted by close formation flying with the slow bombers. Then strike from altitude with speed and surprise. Weber saw them first, sunlight glinting off canopies, small dark shapes growing rapidly larger. He keyed his radio. Achtung, Spitfires high, 6 o'clock. Brake, right. The German formation exploded like a kicked anthill. Pilots shoved throttles forward, engines roared, aircraft scattered in every direction. The textbook response: don't stay clustered, don't give them an easy target, get your nose pointed at the enemy, force them to fight on your terms. But the Spitfires had altitude, they had speed, they had surprise, and one of them had a very personal reason to be there. Flight Lieutenant Marcus Wright, 28 years old, 611 Squadron, pulled his Spitfire's nose through 40 degrees of deflection and fired. The Hispano 20mm cannon in his wings thundered. Spent shell casings tumbled away in the slipstream like golden rain. Tracers arced through the air. Most of the rounds missed. 3 connected. One struck Klaus Hoffmann's engine cowling, punched through the thin aluminum skin, severed an oil pressure line. High-pressure oil sprayed across the hot cylinder heads. Black smoke erupted instantly. Klaus's voice crackled over the radio, tight with strain. "I'm hit oil pressure, dropping. I'm heading home." Weber snap-rolled his Focke-Wulf to the right, pulling 6 Gs, vision tunneling to a grey pinpoint. He tried to position himself to cover Klaus's retreat, tried to get his guns on the Spitfire. But Marcus Wright was already gone, climbing back into the sun for another pass. And Wright wasn't interested in Klaus anymore. Wright had been shot down 4 weeks earlier, April 28th. A Focke-Wulf with a distinctive red spinner had jumped him over the channel. 3 seconds of cannon fire. His Spitfire's left wing had disintegrated. He'd bailed out at 8,000 feet, broken his collarbone on landing, spent 6 hours in the freezing water before rescue. He'd watched that red spinner fly away. He'd memorized every detail of that aircraft. And now, impossibly, he was looking at it again. Wright hauled his Spitfire around in a punishing turn. His vision grayed. His flight suit crushed against his chest. He didn't care. That red spinner. That specific Focke-Wulf, the pilot who'd nearly killed him, right there. 2,000 feet below, he dove. Weber saw him coming, rolled inverted, pulled toward the deck. The Focke-Wulf accelerated like a dropped stone. 400 miles per hour, 420, 440. The controls stiffened. The airframe shuddered. Weber kept the stick back, dove into a cloud bank at 6,000 feet. Behind him, Wright fired again. A 2-second burst, 80 rounds, most missed, 6 connected. 1 20mm shell punched through Weber's left wing root, severed the fuel line from the main tank to the engine. Aviation gasoline began streaming into the slipstream at 3.2 gallons per minute. 2 rounds struck the radio compartment behind the cockpit. The radio exploded in a shower of sparks and acrid smoke. The intercom went dead. Weber was alone. 3 rounds hit the instrument panel, shattered the compass housing. The magnetic compass card flew apart. The needle spun freely on its pivot, pointing at nothing, pointing at everything, useless. Weber emerged from the cloud at 2,000 feet. Alone. The sky around him was empty. No Klaus, no bombers, no Spitfires. Just empty air and scattered clouds. And smoke. Black smoke trailing from his left wing. He glanced at the fuel gauge. The needle was dropping. Fast. Impossibly fast. He'd had 68 gallons 10 minutes ago. Now the gauge read 54 gallons, then 51, then 48. 3 gallons per minute. At that rate, he had 16 minutes before fuel exhaustion. Maybe less if the leak got worse. The engine would quit. The propeller would windmill to a stop. The Focke-Wulf would become a 10,000-pound glider, and Weber would have perhaps 2 minutes to find somewhere to land before he stalled, spun, and died. His hand moved to the radio transmit button, pressed it. Nothing. Dead. He couldn't call for help. couldn't get a bearing from ground stations, couldn't warn anyone he was coming in damaged. He looked at the compass. The needle spun lazily, clockwise, useless. Weber had been trained to navigate by dead reckoning. Every fighter pilot had. Compass heading plus airspeed plus time equals distance. Simple mathematics, but dead reckoning required a functioning compass. Without it, you navigated by landmarks, by the sun, by memory, by guesswork. He looked down. Below him, through breaks in the clouds, he saw water, a large body of water stretching east to west, silver blue under the afternoon sun, 15, maybe 20 miles wide. The English Channel. It had to be. He'd flown over the channel dozens of times. He recognized that distinctive width, that color, that sense of vast emptiness between two land masses. Relief flooded through him. If that was the channel, then the land to the south was France. Occupied France. German-controlled territory. Safety, airfields, mechanics who could patch the fuel leak, a debrief over schnapps and cigarettes, a new compass. Back in the air tomorrow. He banked left, following the water eastward. In his mind, he was paralleling the French coast. Calais was to the east, dozens of Luftwaffe airfields. He'd pick one land, be home by dinner, but Thomas Weber wasn't looking at the English Channel. He was looking at the Bristol Channel, the body of water separating South Wales from southwest England. And the land to the south wasn't France, it was Wales, enemy territory. His damaged compass had failed during the dogfight. The violent maneuvers, the shock of cannon strikes, had shaken the magnetic card loose from its pivot. During his dive through the clouds, he'd completed a 180-degree turn without realizing it. Spatial disorientation, every pilot's nightmare. In clouds without instruments, the human inner ear lies. Up feels like down, left feels like right. You can be inverted and convinced you're flying level. Weber had turned himself completely around. He thought he was flying east toward France. He was actually flying east deeper into Britain. With every second, he was penetrating farther into enemy airspace, and he had no way of knowing. At 14:35, the engine coughed, a single misfire. The BMW 801 radial had ingested a momentary lean mixture as the fuel system struggled to draw from a nearly empty tank through a severed line. The engine caught again, ran smoothly, but the message was clear. Minutes. He had minutes. Weber scanned the ground. There. A cluster of buildings, hangars, a control tower, a long concrete runway stretching north-south, an airfield. Thank God, a Luftwaffe airfield. It had to be. The Germans controlled everything on this side of the channel, didn't they? He circled once at 800 feet, studying the field below. He saw aircraft parked in neat rows. He saw hangars with open doors. He saw fuel trucks and maintenance vehicles. He saw a control tower with windows reflecting the afternoon sun. Everything looked orderly, professional. Exactly what he expected from a German installation. What he didn't notice, couldn't notice from 800 feet through oil-smeared goggles and adrenaline-narrowed vision were the RAF roundels painted on those parked aircraft. The red, white, blue circles that marked British fighters. He didn't see the Union Jack flying from the control tower's flagpole. He saw what he expected to see, what he desperately needed to see. Salvation. Weber dropped his landing gear. The hydraulics whined. The gear doors opened. The main wheels extended with solid mechanical clunks. 3 green lights appeared on the panel. Gear down and locked. Airspeed bled away. The Focke-Wulf wallowed in the air like a tired bird, the wide-track landing gear creating enormous drag. He lined up his approach. Runway 23. Wind from the west at 8 knots. Slight crosswind. Nothing difficult. He'd landed in worse. His hands moved through the familiar checklist. Mixture rich. Propeller full forward. Flaps down 20 degrees. Airspeed 110 miles per hour. Descent rate 300 feet per minute. On the ground at RAF Pembrey Squadron Leader Alistair Cunningham stood outside the control tower with a clipboard watching a training flight taxi into position. Cunningham was 35 years old, a career RAF officer who'd flown Hurricanes during the Battle of Britain. He'd been posted to Pembrey as station commander 3 months earlier. Quiet duty, training flights, administrative work. The war felt distant here in South Wales, reduced to radio reports and distant explosions across the channel. A sergeant shouted from the tower window, "Sir, incoming aircraft. Single engine. Damaged. Unknown type." Cunningham turned, shielding his eyes against the sun. There, descending from the southeast, trailing smoke, an aircraft he didn't recognize. The nose was too long, the wings too short, the whole profile wrong. Not a Spitfire, not a Hurricane, not anything British. His stomach dropped. "That's a Jerry," someone breathed beside him. The word rippled through the small crowd gathering on the tarmac. German. Enemy, here, now, descending toward their runway with landing gear down. Cunningham's mind raced. Was this a defector, a trick? A damaged raider trying to surrender? The aircraft wasn't firing. No bombs visible, no aggression, just a wounded fighter limping home. Except home was 200 miles southeast across enemy waters. Not here, never here. "Hold fire!" Cunningham barked. "Nobody shoots unless I give the order." Airmen grabbed rifles from the armory. Others simply stood frozen, watching something impossible unfold before their eyes. A German fighter landing at an RAF base in the middle of the day as casually as if it belonged there. At 14:46, Weber's Focke-Wulf crossed the runway threshold at 98 miles per hour. He eased the stick back. The nose rose slightly. The main wheels kissed the concrete with a chirp of rubber. The aircraft bounced once, settled, and rolled smoothly down the center line. Perfect landing. Textbook. The kind they taught to student pilots as the ideal touchdown. Weber let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The tail wheel touched down. He tapped the brakes gently. The Focke-Wulf slowed. The engine coughed one final time and quit. Fuel exhaustion. The propeller windmilled to a stop. Silence except for wind rushing past the canopy and the tick of cooling metal. He'd made it. Safe. Alive. Weber guided the dead aircraft off the runway with momentum and brake steering. It rolled to a stop near the control tower. He sat for a moment in the sudden quiet, hands shaking with adrenaline come down. Sweat cooled on his face. He could smell aviation fuel and burned electrical insulation and his own fear. He reached up and popped the canopy. It slid back on its rails. Fresh Welsh air rushed in, cool and clean and wonderful, and that's when he saw them. British uniforms, RAF blue, 30 men in a semicircle around his aircraft, rifles pointed directly at his cockpit, RAF roundels on the parked Spitfires behind them, a Union Jack snapping in the breeze atop the control tower, not France. Britain. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His hands froze on the canopy rail, his blood turned to ice water, his vision narrowed to a pinpoint. He had landed in Britain. He had navigated 180 degrees opposite his intended course. He had flown deeper into enemy territory while convinced he was heading home. He had delivered Germany's most advanced fighter aircraft, intact and flyable, directly into British hands. The magnitude of the error crushed down on him like a physical weight. His throat constricted. He couldn't breathe. Around him, British airmen stood with weapons raised, their faces showing shock and confusion and grim satisfaction. Squadron leader Alistair Cunningham stepped forward, service revolver drawn but pointed at the ground. He looked up at the young German pilot whose face had gone chalk white with dawning horror. Cunningham's German was rusty, learned during a university exchange program 15 years earlier, but serviceable. "Raus aus dem Flugzeug," he said slowly, carefully. "Hände hoch." Out of the aircraft. "Hands up." Weber understood. He raised his trembling hands slowly, very slowly, and stood in the cockpit. He was tall, nearly 6 feet, with dark hair plastered to his forehead by sweat. A cut above his left eye bled down his cheek. He wore the standard Luftwaffe flight suit, grey-green fabric, with leather patches at knees and elbows. An iron cross was pinned to his chest. A young ace who'd shot down 7 Allied aircraft in 4 months. A rising star in the Reichsfighter Command. Now a prisoner. His mind reeled. How had this happened? He'd followed the coast. He'd navigated by landmarks. He'd seen the channel with his own eyes. The compass. It must have been the compass, damaged in combat, spinning false readings, leading him exactly opposite of where he thought he was going. The cruelest possible mistake. 2 British airmen approached cautiously, rifles steady. Weber climbed out of the cockpit. His legs nearly buckled as his boots touched foreign soil. The airman caught him by the elbows, not roughly, just firmly. Human instinct taking over from military protocol.
"Jesus Christ," one of them muttered in English. "He actually landed here, just bloody landed." Cunningham holstered his revolver and walked closer, studying the aircraft with open fascination. The Focke-Wulf 190, they'd heard about it. Intelligence reports, pilot debriefs, the new German fighter that was supposedly superior to the Spitfire Mark V. Faster, better climb rate, heavier armament. The aircraft Allied pilots feared. And here it sat. Intact, barely damaged beyond some bullet holes and a fuel leak. The engine still warm. Every system accessible, every secret laid bare. Cunningham felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't just a captured pilot. This was intelligence gold. This was the kind of windfall that changed wars. He turned to Weber, who stood between two guards, hands now cable-tied behind his back with canvas straps. The German's face showed pure anguish, shame, horror. The look of a man who'd just committed an unforgivable sin. "Sergeant Davies," Cunningham called.
Get Group Captain Wilson on the telephone immediately, then ring RAF Farnborough. Tell them we have a gift for them. Davies sprinted toward the tower. Around the Focke-Wulf airmen gathered like pilgrims before a shrine, touching the metal skin, peering into the cockpit, examining the wide-track landing gear, the heavy nose-mounted cannons. One mechanic old enough to have worked on biplanes in the last war ran his hand along the engine cowling and whistled low. "Look at this," he breathed. "BMW 801 radial engine, 14 cylinders. Look at the size of those exhaust stubs. This thing must be fast as hell." A young pilot, barely 19, stared at the aircraft with something close to reverence. "Our boys are fighting these." Cunningham nodded grimly. "Not for much longer. Now we'll know everything about them." Thomas Weber was led toward a small brick building that served as the station office. He walked stiffly, mechanically, his mind trying to process the magnitude of his failure. He had handed Britain the Reich's most advanced fighter. He had betrayed every secret of the Focke-Wulf's performance. He had given the enemy exactly what they needed to counter German air superiority. The weight of that realization threatened to crush him. Inside the office, 2 RAF officers waited. One was Captain Edmund Blackwood, an intelligence officer who'd been hastily summoned from the operations room. Blackwood was 40 years old, thin and bookish, with the careful manner of an academic thrust into military service. He spoke fluent German learned during pre-war research trips to Berlin. "Oberleutnant Weber," Blackwood began, his tone neutral and professional. "You are now a prisoner of war. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Do you understand?" Weber nodded mutely. Blackwood studied him for a moment. "You're not the first German pilot we've captured, but you are the first to land voluntarily on one of our airfields." "I did not land voluntarily," Weber said, his voice raw. I believed I was over France." Blackwood translated for the other officer, who gave a short, humorless laugh. "Your compass?" Blackwood asked. Weber looked down at his boots. "Damaged in combat. I navigated by sight. I saw the channel. I thought—" He couldn't finish. The enormity of the mistake was suffocating. Blackwood leaned back in his chair. "You've had a very bad day, Oberleutnant. But you're alive. That's more than many pilots can say." Weber's jaw tightened. "Alive, yes. But dishonored. Captured. Responsible for potentially thousands of German deaths as Allied pilots learned to exploit every weakness in the Focke-Wulf 190. His survival felt like a curse." A medic entered carrying a small medical kit. He approached Weber cautiously, gesturing to the cut above his eye. "May I—" Weber hesitated, then nodded. The medic worked quickly, efficiently, cleaning the wound with antiseptic that stung like fire. Weber flinched, but didn't pull away. The medic applied a bandage and stepped back. "You'll be all right," he said in English. Weber understood the tone, if not all the words. The same professionalism, the same basic human decency. It confused him. Everything he'd been told about the British painted them as ruthless, dishonorable enemies. Yet here, in the first hour of his captivity, he'd been treated with more care than he'd expected. Outside, the Focke-Wulf 190 was already being photographed from every angle. Group Captain Wilson, the regional commander, had arrived within minutes, his staff car kicking up dust as it skidded to a stop near the aircraft. Wilson walked around it slowly, deliberately, his weathered face showing no emotion, but inside his mind was calculating. This single aircraft, captured intact, represented an intelligence breakthrough that could shift the entire air war. For months, RAF pilots had been reporting encounters with a new German fighter that outperformed their Spitfire Mark V's faster in a dive. Better roll rate, heavier firepower. The Focke-Wulf had been cutting through British formations with devastating efficiency. Pilots were dying because they didn't understand their enemy's capabilities. Now they would. Every rivet, every control surface, every performance characteristic would be tested, measured, documented. British engineers would disassemble the engine, study the fuel injection system, examine the armament. Test pilots would fly it, push it to its limits, discover its weaknesses, and within weeks new tactics would be distributed to every RAF squadron. Attack from above, force them into turning fights, exploit the Focke-Wulf's poor high-altitude performance, target the cooling system. Know when to engage and when to run. This single landing, this one navigational error by one confused German pilot would save hundreds of Allied lives. Wilson turned to his operations officer. "I want this aircraft under armed guard around the clock. No one touches it without authorization from Farnborough. The transport team should arrive by morning." The officer saluted and rushed off to issue orders. Wilson looked toward the station office where Weber was being held. 22 years old, an ace, a skilled pilot who'd made one catastrophic mistake. In another world, they might have shared a drink, talked about flying, compared notes on tactics. But this was war, and war had no sympathy for honest mistakes. Inside the office, Weber sat on a wooden chair, hands still cable-tied, staring at the floor. Blackwood had left to coordinate with intelligence services in London. The two guards stationed at the door looked uncomfortable, uncertain how to treat a prisoner who'd simply landed and walked into captivity. One of them, a corporal named Davies, cleared his throat. Would you like some water?" Weber looked up, surprised. Davies held out a canteen. Weber hesitated, then nodded. Davies carefully held the canteen to Weber's lips, letting him drink. The water was cool, clean. The best thing Weber had tasted in hours. "Thank you," he said in careful English. Davies nodded and stepped back. The small gesture of humanity, so simple, so unexpected, made something break inside Weber. His eyes burned. He blinked hard, refusing to cry in front of his captives. But the weight of what he'd done, the scale of his failure, pressed down on him like a physical force. He had been so sure, so certain he was flying towards safety, following the coast home, making the right decisions, and every decision had been exactly precisely wrong. The afternoon sun slanted through the office window, casting long shadows across the floor. Outside, British airmen continued to swarm around the Focke-Wulf, touching it, examining it, already beginning to understand what they'd been given. Thomas Weber sat alone with his thoughts, with his guilt, with the terrible knowledge that his 5-minute landing had just changed the war. And somewhere across the Channel, in occupied France, Klaus Hoffmann's damaged fighter was being towed into a hangar. The mechanics would shake their heads at the oil-soaked engine. Klaus would sit in the ready room, smoking, waiting for news of his wingman, news that would never come. Because Thomas Weber had disappeared into British skies, and he would not be coming home. By sunset on June 23, 1942, word of the capture had reached the highest levels of British command. Air Vice Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, commanding No. 11 Group Fighter Command, received the telephone call at 18:35 hours. He listened in silence, asked 3 clarifying questions, then set down the receiver with a hand that trembled slightly. A Focke-Wulf 190, intact, flyable, sitting on British soil like a Christmas present wrapped in aluminum and German engineering. He immediately placed 2 calls. The first went to the Air Ministry in London. The second went to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. Both conversations were brief. Both ended with the same instruction: get that aircraft to Farnborough, tonight, by any means necessary, at RAF Pembrey. As darkness fell across South Wales, armed sentries took up positions around the Focke-Wulf. 4 men per shift, loaded rifles, orders to challenge anyone who approached within 50 feet. The aircraft sat like a sleeping predator on the tarmac, its wide landing gear and blunt radial engine giving it a brutish, powerful appearance even at rest. Inside the station office, Thomas Weber remained under guard. Captain Edmund Blackwood had returned with a thermos of tea and a plate of bread and cheese. He set them on the desk in front of Weber, whose hands were now untied. "Eat," Blackwood said in German. You'll be transferred tomorrow. Long journey ahead." Weber looked at the food without appetite. His stomach felt like a clenched fist. But he was 22 years old, and his body demanded fuel regardless of his mental state. He ate mechanically, tasting nothing. Blackwood pulled up a chair. "Tell me about the compass failure." Weber swallowed. "It happened during the combat. The Spitfire's cannon fire struck the instrument panel. I saw the housing shatter. After that, the needle spun freely. I thought I could navigate by landmarks." "And you saw the Bristol Channel?" "I saw what I thought was the English Channel." Weber's voice was flat, defeated. "The width looked correct, The orientation east-west. I assumed France was to the south. And then, you'd flown over the channel before. Dozens of times. Then you know what it looks like. Yes, and the Bristol Channel looks identical from 800 feet when you're running on fumes, and your radio is dead, and your wingman is gone. Weber set down the bread. I saw what I expected to see, what I needed to see. Blackwood nodded slowly. The human mind is remarkable that way. We construct reality from expectations rather than evidence. He paused. Your wingman, did he make it back? Weber's throat tightened. I don't know. His engine was hit. Oil pressure was gone. He was heading west when I lost sight of him. West was correct. We would have been east. The implication hung in the air. Klaus had navigated correctly with a dying engine. Weber had navigated incorrectly with a functioning aircraft. The mathematics of failure couldn't be clearer. Blackwood poured tea into a tin cup and slid it across the desk. For what it's worth, you made the only rational choice available. Land safely or die trying to reach what you thought was friendly territory. You chose survival. I chose wrong. You chose to live. There's a profound difference. Weber wrapped his hands around the cup, absorbing its warmth. Outside voices called back and forth as the guard shift changed. British voices, enemy voices, except they didn't sound like enemies. They sounded like tired men doing their duty, no different from Klaus, from himself, from every pilot on both sides who flew and fought and tried not to die. What will happen to the aircraft? Weber asked quietly. Blackwood considered his answer carefully. It will be studied, analyzed, test-flown, every system examined, every performance characteristic measured. We'll learn everything it has to teach us. And then you'll use that knowledge to kill more of my countrymen. Yes, just as your countrymen use captured intelligence to kill mine. That's the machinery of war, Oberleutnant. Information flows like ammunition. Both kill efficiently. Weber closed his eyes. The aircraft sitting outside represented more than his personal failure. It was a breach in the wall, a crack through which intelligence would pour like floodwater. RAF engineers would measure what German designers had labored to perfect. British pilots would learn what Luftwaffe tacticians had worked to conceal, and German pilots would die because of it. I should have crashed into the sea, he whispered. Then you'd be dead and we'd still have your aircraft. Wreckage washes ashore, Oberleutnant. We'd have recovered it from a beach perhaps more damaged but still informative. Your death would have accomplished nothing except depriving your mother of a son. The mention of his mother struck deeper than expected. She lived in Cologne, worked as a schoolteacher. She'd cried when he joined the Luftwaffe, cried again when he'd come home on leave with the Iron Cross pinned to his uniform. She wrote him letters every week, careful, neutral sentences about weather and neighbors and the small dignities of civilian life. She hated the war, but loved her son. And now her son had committed the unforgivable, not death in combat, which she could have mourned with honor, but survival through catastrophic error. Capture that would arm the enemy with knowledge to kill more German sons. Blackwood stood. Get some rest. Tomorrow you'll be moved to a transit camp, then a permanent facility. The war will end eventually, Oberleutnant. You'll go home. Try to hold on to that. After he left, Weber lay down on a cot that had been brought in. The blanket smelled of mothballs and old wool. Through the window he could see the silhouette of the Focke-Wulf against the darkening sky, his aircraft, his responsibility, his betrayal rendered in aluminum and steel. He didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling and listened to the night sounds of an enemy base. Footsteps, voices, the distant rumble of vehicles. And he thought about Klaus, hoping his wingman had made it home, knowing he himself never would. At 300 hours, a convoy arrived from Farnborough. 3 trucks, 1 flatbed trailer, a team of 12 men led by a civilian in a rumpled suit who looked like he hadn't slept in days. This was Reginald Ashworth, chief engineer at the Royal Aircraft Establishment. He was 55 years old, had designed aircraft before the war, and possessed the kind of mind that could look at an airplane and understand its secrets the way a surgeon understands anatomy. Ashworth circled the Focke-Wulf slowly, his flashlight beam probing panel lines, examining control surfaces, studying the landing gear mechanism. He touched the metal skin with something approaching reverence. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Gentlemen, this is the most important aircraft in Britain tonight, possibly in the world. Treat it accordingly. The disassembly began immediately. The wings had to be removed for transport. Ashworth supervised every step, personally photographing each connection before disconnection, marking every bolt location, ensuring that not a single component was lost or damaged. By 800 hours on June 24th, the Focke-Wulf was loaded onto the trailer, shrouded in canvas tarps, and ready for the 11-hour drive to Farnborough. Armed escorts surrounded the convoy, 2 motorcycles in front, 2 trucks of soldiers behind. They drove through the English countryside in daylight, maintaining strict radio silence. Farmers working their fields looked up as the strange procession passed, saw military vehicles, thought nothing of it. They had no idea they were watching the most valuable intelligence asset in Europe rolling past their hedgerows and stone walls. The convoy arrived at Farnborough at 1900 hours. The base had been prepared, Hangar 7 had been cleared, locked, and placed under armed guard. Only personnel with specific authorizations signed by Ashworth himself were permitted within 100 yards. The team worked through the night. Wings reattached with meticulous care, aircraft positioned on jacks, photographers documenting every angle. The serial number on the fuselage was recorded with particular attention, work number 313. The distinctive red spinner that marked it as Weber's personal aircraft was noted, photographed from 12 different angles. By June 25th, the systematic dissection began. Ashworth started with what mattered most, the engine. The BMW 801D2 was a masterpiece of German engineering, and he approached it with the focused intensity of a scholar examining an illuminated manuscript. Every bolt location was marked before removal. Every connection was photographed. Every component was catalogued. The engine was extracted over 8 hours, lifted carefully onto a specialized test stand, instrumented with sensors that would measure temperatures, pressures, vibrations. The first test run came at 1400 hours on June 26th. The BMW 801 roared to life with a sound unlike any British engine. Deeper, more aggressive. The 14 cylinders arranged in 2 radial rows produced a distinctive bark that made technicians stop their work and listen. This was the sound RAF pilots had learned to fear, the acoustic signature of death approaching at 400 miles per hour. Ashworth stood in the test cell, watching gauges, recording numbers in his leather journal. Maximum power, 1,730 horsepower at 2,700 RPM at sea level. He compared this mentally to the Rolls-Royce Merlin in the Spitfire Mark V, 1,470 horsepower, 260 horsepower difference, enough to give the Focke-Wulf decisive advantages in acceleration, climb rate, energy retention. But as the test progressed through different altitude simulations, Ashworth noticed something critical. At simulated altitude above 20,000 feet, the BMW's power dropped precipitously. The single-stage supercharger couldn't compress enough thin air to maintain performance. Power fell to barely 1,200 horsepower at 25,000 feet. He wrote in his journal, "Critical weakness identified. Above 20,000 feet, engine power degrades severely. Tactical implication: force high-altitude engagements wherever possible." The fuel injection system was examined next, and this revelation was almost as significant as the power figures. British fighters used carburetors which suffered from a critical flaw during negative G maneuvers, pushing the stick forward. Diving with negative acceleration, fuel flow was interrupted. The engine would cut out for crucial seconds. German pilots knew this. They exploited it ruthlessly, pushing into negative G dives that British fighters couldn't follow without their engines quitting. The BMW's direct fuel injection had no such limitation. Push, pull, roll, any maneuver, the fuel flowed continuously, the engine ran smoothly. Ashworth's tactical note was immediate. "Our pilots cannot follow FW190 into negative G maneuvers. Recommend alternative roll, inverted first, then pull. Maintains positive G, maintains engine power." Over the following week, every system was scrutinized. The armament: 27.9 2mm MG-17 machine guns with 1,000 rounds, each 220mm MG-151/20 cannons with 250 rounds each. When fired simultaneously, the Focke-Wulf delivered 3.8 kilograms of projectile mass per second, nearly double the Spitfire Mark V's 2.1 kilograms per second. Devastating firepower. But the cannon ammunition capacity was limited. 250 rounds per gun meant approximately 21 seconds of firing time at the cannon's 700 rounds per minute cyclic rate. In combat, pilots fired in 1 to 3 second bursts, 7 to 10 bursts maximum before the cannons ran dry. Ashworth's conclusion: if engagement can be prolonged beyond 30 seconds of active combat, FW190's primary armament will be exhausted, reduced to machine guns only. Significant threat reduction. The cockpit was studied with particular attention to visibility. The canopy design provided exceptional sight lines, better than the Spitfire's framework-heavy design. The pilot who saw his enemy first held an enormous advantage. First sight meant first shot. First shot often meant only shot. Ashworth acknowledged this limitation frankly, cannot match their visibility advantage through design changes to existing aircraft, must compensate through enhanced tactical awareness, better radio discipline coordinated formations, make multiple pairs of eyes equal their single superior pair. The wide-track landing gear was examined and its advantage immediately apparent. Stability during takeoff and landing, reduced ground loop tendency, easier for less experienced pilots. The Spitfire's narrow gear was notoriously unforgiving. Young pilots died in landing accidents. The Focke-Wulf's gear forgave mistakes. By July 1st, Ashworth had compiled a preliminary report, 15 pages of dense technical analysis. The conclusions were stark and undeniable. The Focke-Wulf 190 was superior to the Spitfire Mark V in maximum speed, acceleration rate of climb below 20,000 feet, roll rate, firepower, cockpit visibility, negative G performance and ease of operation. It was inferior in turning radius high-altitude performance above 20,000 feet and sustained combat endurance due to limited cannon ammunition. The tactical implications were immediate and severe. RAF fighters couldn't outperform the Focke-Wulf in most combat situations. They would have to outthink it, force it into situations where its weaknesses mattered more than its strengths. On July 2nd, the aircraft was declared ready for flight testing. Squadron leader Geoffrey Blackwood, age 32, was selected for this historic and dangerous assignment. Geoffrey was Edmund Blackwood's younger brother. He'd flown Spitfires operationally for 2 years, survived 18 combat engagements, shot down 4 German aircraft. He possessed the rare combination of skill, analytical mind, and measured temperament necessary for proper evaluation of an enemy fighter. The briefing took place in Ashworth's cramped office. "You'll be flying an aircraft that may have been sabotaged," Ashworth said bluntly. "Hidden flaws, deliberate weaknesses. If anything feels wrong, anything at all, abort immediately and bail out. We need data, squadron leader, but we need you alive more." Geoffrey nodded. "Understood? What's the evaluation priority?" "Complete performance envelope. Speed climb rate, handling characteristics at all altitudes and configurations. Push it to operational limits, but controlled limits. We need to know what our pilots are facing every time they encounter one of these, and what we can exploit." "Precisely." On July 2nd, at 9:15 hours, Geoffrey Blackwood climbed into the Focke-Wulf's cockpit for the first time. The seat fit differently than a Spitfire. The control stick was positioned more centrally. The instrument panel was logical but alien. Everything labelled in German. He'd studied the translations, memorized the layout, but intellectual knowledge differed from operational familiarity. He ran through the start checklist, working from notes taped to his kneeboard. Master switch on, fuel pump on, mixture rich, throttle cracked 1/2 inch, magnetos both, engage starter. The BMW 801 caught on the third blade, coughed once, then settled into that distinctive, powerful rumble. The whole aircraft vibrated with barely contained violence. Geoffrey felt the raw power through the airframe, through his seat, through his hands on the controls. This was a machine built for a single purpose, killing other aircraft. He taxied to the runway, learning the controls. The wide-track landing gear made ground handling remarkably stable, much better than the Spitfire's nervous, narrow stance. Visibility over the nose during taxi was excellent. He could see exactly where he was going. At the runway threshold, he advanced the throttle smoothly. The BMW roared its distinctive aggressive note. The Focke-Wulf surged forward with startling acceleration. The tail lifted almost immediately. Forward visibility opened up completely. At 80 miles per hour, he eased back on the stick and the fighter leapt into the air as if impatient to fly. Gear up, flaps up, climb power. The Focke-Wulf climbed at 2,600 feet per minute. Geoffrey noted this with professional appreciation and private concern. The Spitfire Mark V managed 2,050 feet per minute. The difference was tactically decisive. A climbing Focke-Wulf could dictate engagement altitude, choose when to fight, choose when to run. At 5,000 feet, he leveled off and explored the handling. Roll rate was extraordinary, crisp, immediate, authoritative. He could snap from hard right bank to hard left bank in under 2 seconds. Combat maneuverability that would be devastating in a turning fight. He tried a loop, pulled 4 Gs, the aircraft handled it smoothly, no buffeting, no tendency to fall out of the maneuver. He tried a barrel roll, perfect control throughout. He tried an Immelmann turn, The aircraft performed it as if the maneuver had been designed specifically for this airframe. Then he climbed to 20,000 feet, and the aircraft's character transformed. The engine labored, power dropped noticeably. The climb rate fell to barely 1,500 feet per minute. At 25,000 feet, the BMW was gasping. The supercharger couldn't compress sufficient air at this altitude. The engine was starving for oxygen. Jeffrey tried combat maneuvers at altitude. The controls felt heavier, response was slower. The weakness was obvious and entirely exploitable. He descended back to 15,000 feet and tested maximum speed. Level flight, full throttle propeller, full forward. The airspeed indicator climbed past 350 miles per hour, past 380, stabilized at 395 miles per hour indicated airspeed. He noted with professional detachment that this was 20 to 30 miles per hour faster than his Spitfire Mark V could achieve. In a straight chase, the Focke-Wulf would escape effortlessly, or close to firing range before the Spitfire could evade. But he also noticed that above 350 miles per hour, the control forces increased dramatically. Roll rate degraded. The aircraft wanted to fly straight and fast. Turning fights at high speed would be difficult, sluggish. After 45 minutes, he landed back at Farnborough. The touchdown was smooth. The wide landing gear absorbed the impact beautifully, forgiving a landing that might have bounced a Spitfire. He taxied back to Hangar 7, shut down the engine, and sat in silence for a long moment. He'd just flown the enemy's best fighter, and now he understood why RAF pilots were dying at rates that made the Air Ministry wake at night in cold sweats. The debrief lasted 3 hours. Jeffrey described every characteristic, every strength, every exploitable weakness. Ashworth took notes with the intensity of a scholar recording gospel. Other engineers asked technical questions, probed for details, built mathematical models from Jeffrey's qualitative observations. The summary report was completed by July 5th. 15 pages of detailed analysis backed by test data, performance curves, and tactical recommendations. The conclusion was unambiguous. The Focke-Wulf 190 outclassed the Spitfire Mark V in almost every measurable category. RAF tactics would need to change immediately and fundamentally. On July the 10th, a courier delivered a classified copy of the report to Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Portal, Chief of the Air Staff. Portal read it twice, once quickly, once slowly with notes. Then he called an emergency meeting of Fighter Command leadership. The meeting convened on July 15th in a secure conference room in London. 20 senior officers gathered around a long mahogany table. The Focke-Wulf report was distributed in sealed envelopes. They read in silence. The silence deepened as understanding sank in. "Gentlemen, sir," Portal began, his voice grave. "We now understand what we're fighting. The question before us is how to fight it when we're outmatched in almost every category." Ma'am, the discussion lasted 6 hours. Tactical doctrines were debated. Aircraft production priorities were adjusted. A crash program to accelerate Spitfire Mark IX deployment was authorized. The Mark IX had a 2-stage supercharger and significantly better high-altitude performance. But it would take months to get Mark IXs to frontline squadrons in meaningful numbers. In the meantime, pilots were dying against an aircraft that outperformed their fighters in nearly every metric except one altitude. The solution emerged from the data tactical asymmetry. If British fighters couldn't outperform the Focke-Wulf, they would force engagements into the narrow envelope where the enemy's advantage disappeared. On August 15, 1942, exactly 7 weeks after Weber's landing, RAF Fighter Command issued Tactical Directive 08/42. Every squadron received copies. Flight leaders studied it like scripture. The key points were specific and uncompromising. Never engage Focke-Wulf 190s below 15,000 feet unless numerical advantage exceeds 3 to 1. The FW190 dominates low-altitude combat through superior power and speed. Force all engagements above 20,000 feet whenever tactically feasible. Climb to altitude before contact. Make the enemy climb to you. Their engines lose 30% power above 20,000 feet. Ours perform adequately. Avoid sustained turning fights. The FW190's roll rate gives it superior maneuverability at combat speeds. Use altitude advantage for slashing attacks. Dive, shoot, climb away using excess speed. Do not remain engaged. Prioritize attacks on the cooling system. The radial engine has vulnerable oil coolers beneath the cowling and behind the cylinders. Damage to cooling systems causes rapid engine failure. Aim accordingly. Prolong engagements when possible. The FW190 carries limited cannon ammunition, approximately 20 seconds of firing time. After cannon exhaustion, threat level reduces by 60%. Force extended combat through evasion and separation. The directive changed everything. Pilots who'd been fighting blind suddenly had a tactical roadmap. They knew what to do, what to avoid, where the enemy was strong, where he was weak. The first operational test came on September the 3rd, 1942. Squadron 611 was assigned bomber escort for a raid on Dieppe. Squadron leader Alistair Cunningham led 12 Spitfires. Among them was Flight Lieutenant Marcus Wright, the pilot who'd shot down Weber on June 23rd. Wright still bore scars from his own April shootdown. His collarbone had healed but ached in cold weather, a permanent reminder. The bombers crossed the French coast at 18,000 feet. Cunningham kept his Spitfires at 23,000 feet above and behind. Altitude advantage, first principle of the new doctrine. At 11:47 hours, ground radar reported enemy fighters approaching from the east. 12 Focke-Wulf 19s from Jagdgeschwader 26, climbing to intercept. Currently at 18,000 feet, Cunningham's voice crackled over the radio, calm and precise. All aircraft maintain altitude. Let them come to us. We fight on our terms today. The German formation climbed aggressively. Their powerful engines pulled them upward at impressive rates. At 20,000 feet, they were still climbing strongly. At 22,000 feet, their climb rate began decreasing. At 24,000 feet, they were laboring engines, struggling in the thin air. Now, Cunningham ordered, diving attack. Hit them fast and climb away. No extended engagements. 12 Spitfires rolled, inverted, and dove. They had altitude, they had speed. They had the advantage of surprise as gravity accelerated them past 400 miles per hour, faster than the Focke-Wulfs could manage in level flight at this altitude. The German fighters tried to maneuver. But at 24,000 feet, their engines couldn't provide enough power for aggressive combat. They were sluggish, vulnerable, exactly as Ashworth's report had predicted. Wright selected a target, a Focke-Wulf with yellow nose markings, the aircraft wallowing slightly as its pilot tried to turn. Wright placed the gun sight pipper just ahead of the enemy fighter, fired a 3-second burst, watched cannon strikes sparkle along the engine cowling, saw white smoke erupt from the cowling junction. Oil. The cooling system was compromised. He didn't stay to watch the result. He pulled up hard, using his excess speed to zoom, climb back to altitude. Traded speed for height, got above the fight again. The damaged Focke-Wulf tried to follow. Its engine temperature gauge climbed rapidly into the red zone. The pilot had no choice. He disengaged, diving away toward France with a dying engine, trailing white smoke. Across the engagement area, the pattern repeated itself. Spitfires diving from altitude advantage. Focke-Wulfs unable to respond effectively at high altitude. 3 German fighters were hit. 2 were damaged severely enough to disengage immediately. 1 was destroyed outright, the pilot bailing out over the channel, his parachute, a white flower against the blue water. Not a single Spitfire was lost. Cunningham landed at base 90 minutes later. The ground crew saw the difference immediately in the pilots' faces. Instead of the grim exhaustion of defeat, there was cautious, almost disbelieving optimism. "It worked," one pilot said, his voice carrying wonder. "The bloody tactics actually worked." Cunningham filed his combat report that evening. The intelligence officer transcribed his assessment carefully. When forced to engage at altitudes above 22,000 feet, the FW-190's performance advantages disappear almost entirely. Our Spitfire Mark 5S are competitive in this envelope. Directive 08/42 is tactically sound. Recommend continued emphasis on forcing high-altitude engagements. The report was forwarded up the chain of command within hours. By September the 5th, additional tactical bulletins were issued based on the Dieppe engagement's lessons. The shift in loss rates was measurable and immediate. In June and July 1942, RAF loss ratios against Focke-Wulf 190s had been 2.3 to 1 for every German fighter lost. The RAF lost 2.3 aircraft. By September, after implementation of the new tactics, the ratio improved to 1.1 to 1, near parity. By December, with Spitfire Mark 9s arriving in increasing numbers, the ratio reversed to 0.8 to 1 in RAF favor. Thomas Weber's landing at Pembry had fundamentally altered the tactical balance of the air war over Europe, and Thomas Weber knew it. He was transferred on June 25th to a transit camp in southern England, processed through intake with cold efficiency, personal belongings confiscated, prison uniform issued, identification number assigned. From there, on July 8th, he was moved to a permanent prisoner of war facility, designated POW Camp 185, located in Yorkshire. Population 847 German prisoners, mostly Luftwaffe aircrew, shot down over Britain. Weber arrived in a canvas-covered truck with 15 other newly captured men. They shuffled through the camp gates under guard, were documented, photographed, assigned to barracks. News traveled fast in the enclosed world of the camp. A pilot from JG-26 recognized Weber's name during evening roll call. The whisper spread like fire through dry grass. That's the Pembrey pilot, the one who landed the 190 intact. Reactions varied. Some prisoners refused to speak to him. Others muttered insults as he passed in corridors. One young pilot, barely 20 years old, spat at his feet in the mess hall. An older prisoner intervened before violence could erupt. This was Otto Klein, 45 years old, a former bomber pilot shot down during the Battle of Britain in 1940. Klein had been a prisoner longer than most. Time and perspective had taught him things anger couldn't. "Leave him alone," Klein said to the young pilot, his voice carrying the authority of age. "He gave the British our best aircraft. Do you understand what that means? I understand he made a navigation error while wounded, low on fuel, with a malfunctioning compass. I understand that errors happen in combat. What would you have done differently?" The young pilot had no answer. He walked away, still angry, but quieter. Klein turned to Weber, who stood frozen, expecting the violence to resume. "You'll get this reaction often. Ignore it. They don't understand. Most of them are too young to understand." Weber nodded, grateful but unable to speak, past the tightness in his throat. That night, lying on his bunk in the crowded barracks, Weber listened to voices filtering through thin walls. Two prisoners arguing in the next room, unaware he could hear every word. "I heard the British issued new tactics against the 190, something about forcing high-altitude combat. Where would they learn that?" A pause, then with venom. "Where do you think—" "From the aircraft. That idiot landed at Pembrey. They took it apart, learned everything. Now our pilots are dying because of him." Weber pulled the thin blanket over his head, but he couldn't block out the voices, couldn't silence the knowledge that somewhere right now, at this exact moment, German pilots were engaging British fighters who knew exactly where the Focke-Wulf was weak, who forced combat to high altitude, who aimed for cooling systems, who survived because of knowledge derived from his aircraft. The weight was crushing. On October 12, 1942, Weber received an unexpected visitor. Captain Edmund Blackwood arrived at the camp, dressed in civilian clothes, carrying a leather briefcase. Security cleared him through. They met in a small interview room, bare except for a table and two chairs. Blackwood set a folder on the table between them. "I thought you should understand what your aircraft has taught us." He opened the folder. Inside were photographs. The Focke-Wulf in Hangar 7 at Farnborough. The engine mounted on the test stand. Geoffrey Blackwood in the cockpit, preparing for the first test flight. "We've flown it extensively," Blackwood continued, his tone matter-of-fact. "Tested every system, measured every performance characteristic. Your aircraft has been extraordinarily educational." Weber stared at the photographs, unable to look away, unable to stop looking. "Based on what we learned, we issued new tactical guidance to our fighter squadrons on August 15th. Early operational results have been very positive. Our loss rates have decreased significantly." "How many?" Weber asked, his voice barely audible. "How many what?" "How many German pilots have died because of what you learned from my aircraft?" Blackwood was quiet for a moment. "I don't have precise numbers, but our increased tactical effectiveness means more German aircraft shot down, more pilots killed or captured. I won't insult you by pretending otherwise." Weber closed his eyes. "But," Blackwood continued carefully, "our decreased losses mean more British pilots survive, more return to their families, more fly again to protect our country. The intelligence from your aircraft has likely saved between 200 and 300 RAF lives already, and that number will grow, at the cost of German lives. Yes, that's the arithmetic of war, Oberleutnant. Your side kills ours, our side kills yours. Intelligence accelerates the process, makes it more efficient, more lethal." He paused. "But you didn't choose this outcome. You didn't defect. You didn't sell secrets for money or ideology. You made a navigation error while trying desperately to survive. That's not betrayal. That's human." Weber opened his eyes, meeting Blackwood's gaze. "Do you expect that distinction to help me sleep?" "No, I expect it to help you survive the next 3 or 4 years as a prisoner without destroying yourself." Blackwood's voice softened slightly. I've seen what guilt does to men in your situation. I've watched them stop eating, stop caring, eventually stop living. They waste away from the inside. I don't want that to be your fate." He stood, preparing to leave. "You made a choice to land rather than crash into the sea, to live rather than die. That choice has had enormous consequences, consequences you couldn't have predicted and couldn't control. But the alternative was your death, and we would still have recovered your aircraft. Perhaps from the channel bed, perhaps from a beach. We would have learned from it regardless. Your survival changed the outcome for you alone." He picked up his briefcase. "Try to remember that when the guilt becomes unbearable." After Blackwood left, Weber sat alone in the interview room for 20 minutes until guards came to return him to the barracks. Through the small window he could see other prisoners in the exercise yard. Some played cards, some talked quietly, some simply existed in the strange suspended animation of captivity, waiting for a war to end so life could resume. He thought about Klaus. Through Red Cross channels he'd learned that his wingman had survived, made it back to France with a seized engine, landed dead stick at a satellite field, walked away with only bruises. Klaus was flying again, still fighting, still alive, and somewhere in the skies over Europe, British pilots were using tactics derived from Weber's aircraft to kill German pilots. Pilots like Klaus, friends, comrades, men with mothers who waited for letters that might never come. The arithmetic was simple and terrible. Every RAF pilot saved by the new tactics meant German pilots died. The balance sheet was written in blood and Weber's name was on every entry. He understood intellectually what Blackwood had tried to explain, that he'd had no real choice, that survival was human, that his death wouldn't have prevented the intelligence loss. But understanding didn't erase guilt. Logic couldn't overrule the weight of consequences. Outside, autumn rain began to fall across Yorkshire, cold and grey and relentless. Weber watched the drops streak down the window and thought about navigation, about compasses that lied, about the impossibly thin line between home and enemy territory, about how easily a man could cross that line, how quickly everything could change, how permanently. He'd flown across that line on June 23rd, and he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand what that crossing meant, trying to calculate the moral mathematics of survival when survival itself became a weapon. The rain continued, the war continued, and Thomas Weber sat in a prisoner of war camp in northern England alive, when perhaps he should have died bearing the weight of a 5-minute decision that would echo through the remainder of the war and the remainder of his life. The war ground on, months became years. The seasons changed outside the barbed wire of POW Camp 185, but inside time seemed suspended in amber. Thomas Weber turned 23 in captivity, then 24, then 25. News filtered into the camp through carefully monitored channels. Red Cross parcels, censored letters, whispered conversations with guards who were sometimes sympathetic, sometimes merely bored. The prisoners pieced together the progress of the war from fragments like archaeologists reconstructing pottery from shards. 1943 brought news of Stalingrad, of North Africa, of Sicily. Germany was no longer advancing. The tide had turned. 1944 brought news of Normandy, of the Eastern Front collapsing, of cities in Germany being bombed into rubble. And with each piece of news, each report of air battles over Europe, Weber wondered how much of it traced back to June 23rd, 1942. How many tactical decisions were informed by the analysis of his Focke-Wulf? How many RAF pilots survived because they'd learned to force German fighters to high altitude? How many German pilots died because the British knew exactly where to aim? The math was impossible to calculate precisely, but Weber tried anyway. Late at night, lying on his bunk while other prisoners snored around him, he ran the numbers in his head. If the tactical directive saved 10 RAF pilots per month, that was 120 per year. Over 2 years, 240 lives. But those pilots flew again, shot down more German aircraft, saved more British lives. The multiplier effect expanded geometrically. And on the other side of the equation, how many additional German pilots were lost because the RAF understood the Focke-Wulf's weaknesses? 10 per month seemed conservative, 20 more realistic. Over 2 years, 480 German deaths. The numbers haunted him. Otto Klein, the older prisoner who'd defended Weber in those early days, noticed his deterioration. Weber was eating less, sleeping poorly, withdrawing into himself. One cold morning in January 1944, Klein sat down beside Weber in the mess hall. "You're going to die in here if you don't stop." Weber didn't look up from his untouched porridge. Stop what? Counting ghosts. I can see it in your eyes. You're adding up bodies. Yours, theirs, everyone's. It's killing you. I gave them the weapon they needed to kill my own people. You gave them nothing. They took. There's a difference. Klein's voice was firm, but not unkind. You were a pilot doing your job. You got shot up. Your compass broke. You navigated wrong. These things happen in war. Not like this. Not with these consequences. Klein sighed. I was shot down in 1940. My bomber crashed near Dover. The British recovered it mostly intact. They learned about our navigation equipment, our bomb sites, our defensive armament. That information helped them shoot down other bombers, other crews, men I knew. He paused. I blamed myself for 2 years. It nearly destroyed me. Weber finally looked at him. How did you stop? I realized I had a choice. I could die of guilt in here, or I could survive and go home when this is over. I chose home. I chose to see my wife again, my children. Klein leaned closer. You're 24 years old. You have 50 years of life ahead of you if you survive this. Don't throw that away because of one bad navigation decision. It's not that simple. It never is, but the alternative is suicide by despair, and that helps no one. Weber said nothing, but he ate the porridge. It was a small thing, but it was something. By spring of 1945, the news accelerated. The Rhine crossed, Berlin surrounded, Hitler dead. And then on May 8, 1945, the announcement that changed everything. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered. The news reached Camp 185 by radio broadcast. The camp commandant assembled all prisoners in the main yard and informed them officially. The war has ended. Germany has capitulated. You will remain here until repatriation arrangements are finalized. This may take several months, but you will go home. The reaction among the prisoners was mixed. Some wept, some cheered, some stood in stunned silence. Weber felt nothing, just a vast, hollow emptiness where emotion should have been. He was 25 years old. He'd been a prisoner for 3 years. He'd flown combat for 18 months. The proportions seemed wrong somehow. He'd spent twice as long as a captive as he had as a fighter pilot. The war that had defined his youth was over, and he didn't know what came next. Repatriation began in August 1945. Prisoners were transported in groups sorted by home region. Weber's group departed Camp 185 on September 3, 1946, exactly 4 years, and 1 day after the Dieppe engagement where RAF tactics based on his aircraft had been used successfully for the first time. The journey took 3 days, by train to Southampton, by ship across the Channel, by truck into the British zone of occupied Germany. Weber stepped off the truck in Hamburg on September 6, 1946. The city was unrecognizable, entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Buildings stood like broken teeth against the sky. Children played in bomb craters, women queued for food rations with hollow-eyed patience. This was home, or what remained of it. He made his way to Cologne by rail, a journey that took 2 days because the tracks were damaged in dozens of places. The train stopped frequently, waited for repairs, detoured around destroyed bridges. Cologne was worse than Hamburg. The cathedral still stood miraculously intact amid devastation, but the rest of the city centre was gone, flattened, burned, erased. Weber's family home in the suburbs had survived, though the windows were blown out and the roof damaged by shrapnel. His mother answered his knock. She was 53 years old, but looked 70, grey hair, thin from rationing, hands trembling as she reached for him. "Thomas," she whispered, "you're alive." They held each other in the doorway for a long time. His father emerged from inside, limping on a leg, wounded in the First World War, re-injured in an air raid shelter collapse in 1944. His younger brother was dead, killed on the Eastern Front in 1944, age 19. The family Weber returned to was diminished, damaged, but alive. That night at dinner, thin soup and black bread, his mother asked carefully, "What will you do now?" Weber had been thinking about that question for months. Find work, rebuild, like everyone else. "Will you stay in Cologne?" "I don't know, there's nothing left here." His father spoke for the first time. "There's family. That's something." Weber nodded, but he wasn't sure it was enough. In the weeks that followed, Weber learned the scope of Germany's defeat. 12 million dead, cities destroyed, the country divided between occupying powers, the economy in ruins, food scarce, hope scarcer. He found work in the British zone as an aircraft mechanic for a civilian freight company that was rebuilding. They needed men who understood airplanes. Weber understood them too well. The work was simple. Maintain DC-3s, replace engines, fix hydraulic systems, keep civilian aircraft flying. It was honest work. It paid enough for food and rent. It kept his hands busy. In 1947, he moved to Hamburg. The city was rebuilding faster than Cologne. More opportunity, more life returning. In 1948, he met Greta Muller at a church social. She was 26 years old, had worked as a nurse during the war, had seen things that left shadows in her eyes. They recognized each other's damage without speaking of it directly. They married in 1949, a small ceremony, a few guests. They couldn't afford much, but it didn't matter. They were building something new from the ruins of what had been. Weber never spoke about the war. Greta asked once in the early days of their marriage. He'd shaken his head and changed the subject. She didn't ask again. Many veterans were like this. The war was a door they'd closed and locked. Opening it let in too much darkness. In 1950, their daughter was born, Helga, perfect and small and entirely unconnected to the horror that had preceded her arrival. Weber held her in the hospital and felt something he hadn't felt in years, hope. Life continued. Work, family, the slow, steady process of rebuilding a country and a life from rubble. In 1953, 8 years after the war's end, Weber received a letter. British postmark, return address R, Ashworth, Surrey, England. He stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. The letter was brief, handwritten in careful English, which Weber could now read thanks to evening classes he'd been taking. Dear Herr Weber. You don't know me, but I know you. I was the chief engineer at Farnborough who examined your Focke-Wulf 190 in 1942. I spent months studying that aircraft, learning its secrets, writing reports that changed how the RAF fought the air war. I am writing now because I recently learned something I thought you should know. My son flew Spitfires during the war. He survived. He is alive today, married, with children of his own. In 1944, he was in a combat engagement over France, where his squadron used high-altitude tactics to engage Focke-Wulf 190s. The tactics worked. His squadron shot down 3 enemy fighters without loss. My son returned home safely. Those tactics came directly from analysis of your aircraft. I know you carry guilt about landing at Pembrey. I cannot tell you what to feel. But I wanted you to know that the intelligence from your aircraft saved my son's life. For that, I am grateful. Respectfully, Reginald Ashworth Weber read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. He didn't respond. What could he say? You're welcome for helping kill German pilots. I'm glad my mistake saved your son while costing others theirs. There were no words that fit, but he kept the letter. It stayed in the drawer for years, unread, but not discarded. Life moved forward. His daughter grew. His work continued. Germany rebuilt itself with remarkable speed. By the late 1950s, the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, had transformed the country. New buildings rose where ruins had stood. Prosperity returned. Weber and Greta had a son in 1955. Karl, 2 children, a small apartment in Hamburg, steady work, a life that bore no resemblance to the war years. He was ordinary, anonymous, just another middle-aged man among millions trying to forget the past and build a future. In 1968, Weber was 48 years old. His children were in school. His hair was graying. He worked as a senior mechanic for Lufthansa, the rebuilt German national airline. He was competent, reliable, unremarkable. That summer, he took a rare trip to London for an aviation industry conference. Lufthansa paid his expenses. It was his first time in Britain since his repatriation in 1946. On his last day in London, with a free afternoon before his return flight, he took the Underground to Hendon, to the Royal Air Force Museum. He told himself he was just curious, just killing time. But he knew what he was looking for. The museum was housed in several large hangars. Aircraft from both world wars were displayed in careful arrangements. Spitfires, Hurricanes, Lancasters, Messerschmitts, captured enemy aircraft alongside British defenders. Weber walked slowly through the exhibits, reading plaques, studying aircraft he'd only seen as enemies in the sky. And then he found it. Hangar 3, German aircraft section. And there, under spotlights, perfectly preserved, was a Focke-Wulf 190A3, work number 313, his aircraft. The red spinner was still there, the The panel where cannon rounds had struck was still visible, repaired, but marked. The wide landing gear stood at attention. The aircraft looked exactly as he remembered it. Frozen in time, a monument to his greatest mistake. A placard beside it read, Focke-Wulf 190A-3, captured intact, RAF Pembrey, Wales, 23rd June, 1942. This aircraft was flown to Britain by a German pilot who became disoriented during combat and mistook the Bristol Channel for the English Channel. Believing he was landing at a Luftwaffe airfield in France, he executed a perfect landing at RAF Pembrey. The capture of this aircraft intact provided invaluable intelligence. Detailed analysis revealed performance characteristics and tactical weaknesses that significantly influenced RAF fighter tactics for the remainder of the war. This aircraft is considered one of the most important intelligence acquisitions of the Second World War. Weber stood before the aircraft for 20 minutes. Other visitors walked past, glancing at the display, reading the placard, moving on. They saw a museum piece, a historical artifact. Weber saw the cockpit he'd sat in, the controls he'd gripped, the instrument panel where the compass had shattered. He saw June 23rd, 1942. The smoke, the fear, the terrible moment of realization. A young boy, perhaps 8 years old, tugged his father's sleeve. "Papa, look at this one. It says a German pilot landed it by accident." The father read the placard. Imagine that, flying all the way to the wrong country. Was the pilot stupid? No, son, he was confused and scared. War does that to people. They moved on. Weber remained. Eventually, a museum guard approached. "Sir, we're closing in 15 minutes. Weber nodded. "I understand, thank you." He took one last look at the aircraft, at the red spinner that had marked him as an ace, at the fuselage that had carried him into captivity, at the machine that had changed the war. Then he turned and walked away. On the flight back to Hamburg, Weber stared out the window at the clouds below. The Lufthansa 737 cruised at 35,000 feet, far higher than any fighter in the war could have reached. The world had moved on. Technology had advanced. The aircraft that had once represented the cutting edge of military power now sat in museums' curiosities from a brutal past. He thought about the museum placard, one of the most important intelligence acquisitions of the Second World War. He thought about Reginald Ashworth's letter. Saved my son's life. He thought about the German pilots who'd died because British fighters knew exactly how to fight the Focke-Wulf, pilots whose names he'd never know, whose families had received telegrams saying their sons, husbands and brothers were missing, presumed dead. He thought about Klaus Hoffmann. His wingman had survived the war, Weber had learned years later through a chance encounter with another JG2 veteran. Klaus had flown until 1945, been shot down, twice more, survived both times, and now ran a farm in Bavaria. They'd never reconnected. Some gaps were too wide to bridge. He thought about himself. 22 years old, terrified, lost, making the only choice that seemed available, land safely or die trying. Had it been the right choice? He still didn't know. After 26 years, he still didn't know. The question that had tormented him in POW Camp 185 remained unanswered. Should he have crashed into the sea rather than land? Should he have sacrificed himself to prevent the intelligence catastrophe? Edmund Blackwood had argued that it wouldn't have mattered, that the British would have recovered the wreckage anyway, that Weber's death would have changed nothing except depriving his mother of a son, his wife of a husband, his children of a father. But Weber wondered, if he'd died in 1942, Helga and Karl would never have been born, two lives that existed only because he'd chosen survival. Was that mathematics enough to justify everything else? He didn't know. He would never know. The 737 began its descent into Hamburg. The city lights spread below like a constellation. Germany had been rebuilt. The scars remained, but life had returned. His children would grow up in a country at peace. They would never know the hunger, the fear, the moral calculations of war. Perhaps that was enough. In 1982, 14 years after his museum visit, Weber was 62 years old and retired. He lived quietly in a small house in the Hamburg suburbs with Greta. His children were adults with families of their own. Helga was a teacher, Karl was an engineer. Neither had followed their father into aviation. That spring, he received a letter from an aviation historian in England, Dr. Michael Crawford, researching a book about intelligence operations in World War II. He'd somehow tracked down Weber's address. The letter requested an interview. "Your landing at Pembrey is considered one of the most significant intelligence events of the air war. I would be honored to speak with you about your experience." Weber's first instinct was to refuse. He'd never spoken publicly about the war, had never told his story beyond the bare facts required by military historians compiling official records, but something had changed in him. Perhaps it was age, perhaps it was the simple passage of time, perhaps it was the knowledge that he wouldn't live forever, and the story would die with him if he didn't speak. He wrote back agreeing to a brief interview. Dr. Crawford arrived in Hamburg in June 1982, exactly 40 years after the landing. He was a young man, 35, enthusiastic, carrying a tape recorder and a notebook filled with meticulously researched questions. They sat in Weber's small living room. Greta served tea and then excused herself. The tape recorder sat on the coffee table between them, its reels slowly turning. "Herr Weber," Crawford began, "thank you for agreeing to speak with me. I know this must be difficult." "It was 40 years ago," Weber said. "Everything is difficult after 40 years. Can you describe what happened on June 23rd, 1942? And Weber told the story, the mission, the combat, the damaged compass, the navigation error, the landing, the realization. He spoke in a flat, factual tone, as if describing something that had happened to someone else. Crawford listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "Did you realize the significance of what had happened immediately?" "No, I thought I'd simply been captured. The magnitude became clear later." "How did that make you feel?" Weber was quiet for a long moment. "How does any soldier feel when they fail? Guilty, ashamed, responsible for deaths I couldn't prevent and couldn't undo? But you didn't choose to land at Pembry. It was an accident. Accidents have consequences. The intention doesn't erase the result. Do you regret landing? Would you have done differently if you could choose again?" Weber stared at the teacup in his hands. This was the question he'd been asking himself for 40 years. "I wanted to live," he said finally. "At 22 years old, with my fuel gauge on empty and my compass broken and my engine dying, I wanted to survive. I saw an airfield, and I landed. If I had known it was British, would I have chosen differently?" He paused. "I don't know. I'd like to think I would have crashed, rather than give the enemy such valuable intelligence, but I don't know. None of us know what we'd do until we face the choice. The intelligence from your aircraft saved hundreds of Allied lives, and cost hundreds of German lives. Does that balance matter to you?" Weber looked at Crawford directly. "No, because I knew the German pilots. They were real to me, friends, comrades. The Allied pilots were abstract, numbers. I understand intellectually that they were equally human, equally deserving of life, but I can't feel it the same way. I can't mourn strangers the way I mourn friends." Crawford nodded slowly. "That's honest." "It's all I have left, honesty about what I feel, even when those feelings aren't noble." The interview continued for 2 hours. Crawford asked about the POW camp, about repatriation, about Weber's life after the war. Near the end, Crawford asked, "What do you want people to understand about what happened?" Weber considered. "That war reduces people to impossible choices, that good men do terrible things because all the alternatives are worse. That survival is human, not heroic, that we're all just trying to get through and get home." He paused. "And that I'm sorry. I'm sorry Klaus lost his wingman. I'm sorry German pilots died. I'm sorry for all of it, but I'm not sorry I lived." Crawford turned off the tape recorder. "Thank you, Herr Weber. This has been invaluable." After he left, Weber sat alone in the quiet house. He'd spoken the words he'd carried for 40 years. Released them into the world. He didn't feel lighter, but he felt finished. The story was told. The record was complete. In 1990, Thomas Weber died at age 70. Heart failure, quick and relatively painless. Greta was with him. His children came to the hospital. He died surrounded by family in a peaceful Germany, far removed from the war that had defined his youth. The obituary in the Hamburg newspaper was brief. Thomas Weber, 70 aircraft mechanic, died June 18th. Survived by wife, Greta daughter, Helga son Karl, and 4 grandchildren. Services Friday at St. Michael's Church. There was no mention of the war, no mention of Pembry, no mention of the Focke-Wulf that still sat in the RAF museum in Hendon. His family chose that silence deliberately. They knew his story, but they also knew his wish to be remembered as he'd lived, not as the mistake that had defined one day, 48 years earlier. The Focke-Wulf 190 work number 313 remains on display at the RAF museum. Thousands of visitors see it every year. School children learn about it in history classes. Researchers study it in academic papers. It is one of the most famous, Captured Aircraft in History. The museum updated the display placard in 2012, the 70th anniversary of the capture. This aircraft represents one of the most significant intelligence acquisitions of the Second World War. Analysis of this fighter revealed critical tactical information that influenced RAF operations for the remainder of the war. Historian estimates suggest that intelligence derived from this aircraft contributed to saving between 580 and 780 Allied aircrew lives. The German pilot who landed this aircraft, Oberleutnant Thomas Weber, spent 3 years as a prisoner of war. He returned to Germany in 1946, worked as an aircraft mechanic, married, raised a family, and lived quietly until his death in 1990. He rarely spoke about the war. This aircraft stands as a reminder that war's greatest turning points are sometimes accidents, and that individual choices made in moments of crisis can echo through history in ways no one could predict. On a quiet afternoon in 2025, an elderly woman visits the RAF Museum in Hendon. She is in her 70s, walks with a cane, speaks English with a slight German accent. She stands before the Focke-Wulf 190 for a long time. A museum docent notices her and approaches. "It's quite a remarkable aircraft, isn't it?" "Yes," the woman says softly, "quite remarkable."
Did you know that the pilot who landed it was my father, she says. Thomas Weber. I'm Helga. The docent's eyes widen. I had no idea. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to. It's all right. Helga looks at the aircraft. He came here once, in 1968, stood right where I'm standing, never told us about it until years later. What did he say about it? Helga is quiet for a moment. He said it was strange to see his mistake preserved so carefully, like amber trapping an insect, the moment frozen forever while everything else moved on. She touches the barrier rope gently. But he also said he understood why it was here. Because history isn't just the victories and the heroes, it's also the accidents and the survivors and the people who made choices they had to live with forever. The docent nods respectfully. Helga takes one last look at the aircraft. He was a good father, a good husband, a good man. The war was one day of his life.
The rest was family and work and trying to build something better from what had been broken. She turns to leave. "I wanted you to know that. When you tell visitors about this aircraft, remember that the pilot wasn't just a mistake. He was a person. He lived 70 years. This was just 5 minutes of them." The docent watches her walk away through the hangar, past Spitfires and Hurricanes and Lancasters, past the machinery of war, now silent and still. And the Focke-Wulf 190 sits in its spotlight, perfectly preserved, the red spinner still bright, the landing gear still extended as if ready to touch down again at any moment. One broken compass, one 5-minute landing, one man who chose to live. History is built from such moments. The grand and the small, the intentional and the accidental, the heroic and the simply human. Thomas Weber made a navigation error on June 23, 1942. It changed the war. It saved lives. It cost lives. It haunted him for 48 years. And it brought him home to a family that loved him, and children who never knew war. In the end, perhaps, that mathematics is the only kind that matters. The choice to survive, the consequences that follow, and the long, difficult work of living with both. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the complexity of war and the weight of choices made under impossible circumstances, help preserve these memories by subscribing. Share this with someone who understands that history isn't simple, that veterans carried burdens we can barely imagine, and that survival itself can be an act of courage. Next time, we'll examine another moment where individual choice and historical accident collided, the story of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler over Bremen, where enemy pilots made a decision that defied every rule of war. Until then, remember this: every veteran carried their war differently. Some carried victories. Some carried defeats. Some carried accidents that changed everything. Judgment is easy. Understanding is harder. Remembrance is what we owe them all.